Today we're talking about a battle you may not hear on the evening news, but for the people of eastern Burkina Faso. It was a turning point. On the morning of August 20th, 2025, near the village of Futuri, more than 600 armed militants launched an attack. Their goal was clear: take back territory, spread fear, and prove the government could not protect its people. But what followed wasn't fear. It was calm, it was order, and above all, it was a counterattack that had been prepared in advance. In less than 4 hours, over 100 militants were eliminated. Two of the group's most critical leaders, one responsible for logistics, the other for ideological training, did not walk away. What changed? The answer was in the sky. The Bayraktar drone, a Turkish-made unmanned aircraft, had picked up the enemy's movements early. The signal was sent live to command. The Burkina Faso forces weren't just ready. They knew exactly what to do. Armored vehicles were deployed. Coordinates were locked. The plan was executed. This wasn't chasing shadows. This was combat with a map in hand, full light and steady resolve. But don't mistake this for just a military story. Every seized rifle is one less threat tomorrow. Every motorcycle captured is one less fast-moving ambush. Every victory like this one isn't just a win in battle. It's a normal day returned to farmers, to teachers, to children. If you're praying for an Africa that can defend itself, organize itself, and never bow again, stay with this story, because Futuri isn't the end. It's a reminder: when a nation prepares well and believes in itself, no enemy is too large. Let's go back to the battlefield. The time, just after 4 a.m. The place, a dry, rugged stretch of land near Futuri, a quiet village in eastern Burkina Faso. The threat, a wave of over 600 armed militants, coordinated and determined, advancing through the darkness. Their aim was more than land. It was to shake national confidence, to retake control of a region that had begun to believe in peace. But this time, Burkina Faso was not caught by surprise. High above the ground, a Bayraktar drone circled silently. Its sensors picked up heat signatures, vehicle movement, and formation shifts. The data streamed in real time to a command post several miles away. Commanders reviewed the footage. What they saw was not a rumor. It was a formation moving with purpose, toward populated areas. A decision had to be made, and fast. Captain Ibrahim Traoré had been preparing for this moment, under his leadership. Drones were not just surveillance tools. They were part of a strategy. Intelligence was the first line of defense. Before the militants reached their target, armored vehicles were already in motion. Troops were redirected. Positions were fortified. Radios stayed quiet. But every soldier knew the plan. As the sun began to rise, the militants entered what they thought was an unprotected zone. They were wrong. A line of armored vehicles blocked their path. Drone data guided precision fire. Ground troops, trained in close-quarters combat, moved in with discipline. There was no chaos, no panic, only execution. Within the first 30 minutes, the militants' lines began to falter. What they expected to be a surprise attack had become a trap. Bayraktar drones, still circling, tracked fleeing units. Secondary squads intercepted escape routes. Coordinated strikes disabled motorcycles and supply carriers. By 9 a.m., more than 100 militants lay dead. Dozens of weapons were seized, and two of the most critical leaders were gone. Abu Sulleman, known as the mastermind behind supply lines, had overseen fuel routes, arms transfers, and camp coordination. His death severed the logistical web that kept the group running. Abdul Badre, the man behind indoctrination and recruitment, was their voice, the one who kept new fighters coming. With him gone, their morale broke, their purpose cracked, their grip on local youth weakened. But this wasn't just about taking lives. It was about taking back control. One commander later said, "We didn't fight them with more numbers. We fought them with more clarity. And clarity made all the difference. Weapons were catalogued. Ammunition was stored. Motorcycles were loaded onto military trucks. These weren't just trophies. They were tools of violence, now removed from circulation. Every rifle taken meant one less future ambush. Every vehicle seized meant fewer quick strikes. And most importantly, the retreat was disorganized. The enemy didn't fall back in order. They ran. Witnesses from nearby villages say they saw groups of militants drop their weapons, abandoning the fight entirely. Many hid. Some fled into the hills. The psychological blow was complete. What began as an attempted show of strength had ended in humiliation. In the past, similar attacks would have crippled the region. Markets would shut down. Schools would close. Roads would empty. But this time, something different happened. By the next afternoon, small shops reopened. Children went back to class. The local imam led a prayer of thanks at sunset, and farmers returned to their fields. That's what makes this battle significant. Not just the number of enemies neutralized, but the speed at which normal life resumed. The people noticed. They saw the armored patrols still moving through town. They heard the steady hum of drones overhead. But now, instead of fear, those sounds brought comfort. In one local interview, a woman selling vegetables in the market said, "When I hear the drone, I know someone is watching over us. That is not war. That is safety." What happened near Futuri was not just a victory, it was a statement that Burkina Faso's military, once outnumbered and under-equipped, could now plan, respond, and win, and most importantly, that ordinary people could believe again in the power of protection. As news of the Futuri battle spread, what shocked many wasn't just the number of militants neutralized, it was the precision of the entire operation. A large-scale attack, launched under the cover of darkness, had been completely neutralized, not by luck, but through coordination between technology and trained forces. This was the turning point, not just on the battlefield, but in what it meant, for the first time in years. The Burkina Faso military wasn't reacting in fear. They were leading the fight, taking initiative and forcing the enemy into disarray. The Bayraktar drones weren't just watching. They were guiding every movement. They were the eyes in the sky that turned confusion into clarity. As the militants realized they were surrounded, their formation began to crumble. There was no central command left, no clear orders. A few tried to regroup and counterattack, but they were met with precise ground fire, guided by drone data. Others fled east, leaving behind weapons, motorcycles, and even wounded fighters. Meanwhile, the first images from the battlefield began to circulate on local networks. People saw rifles stacked, ammo belts rolled up, dozens of motorcycles left abandoned. Some witnesses claimed they saw fighters toss away their uniforms and run into the bush with nothing but fear. The domestic reaction was immediate. National television called it the most significant victory since Ibrahim Traoré came to power. Independent analysts across the Sahel called it a shift in the region's security posture. But for the people of Futuri, it was something more personal, peace. Felt for the first time in years, a local schoolteacher said. "I used to teach in fear. Every day I'd look out the window wondering if we'd have to run. Today, I unlocked the door with gratitude. Our children deserve to feel protected." Meanwhile, families of soldiers called one another to share the news. They weren't just celebrating survival. For the first time, they felt that sacrifice had meaning, that their country wasn't just resisting, it was rising, with direction, with planning, and with purpose. International observers soon took note. A West African security report stated, "The counter-operation at Futuri demonstrates that smaller, well-trained forces supported by real-time intelligence can outmaneuver and overwhelm numerically superior militant groups. A senior security official in a neighboring state simply said, "We need to study this model." At a higher level, analysts in Europe and the US began to discuss the Burkina Faso framework, not because drones alone change everything, but because of how drones, armored vehicles, and disciplined troops were integrated into a system: clear command, reliable intelligence, swift execution for local residents. None of this required charts or briefings. They measured progress by life itself. Roads reopened. Market stalls returned. Vendors sold produce without glancing over their shoulders. Laughter returned to porches. Weddings resumed. Evening prayers were once again held in public. Step by step, normal life returned, and people noticed. They noticed the patrols. They heard the steady hum of drones. But now, those sounds didn't bring fear. They brought reassurance. One woman in the market said, "When I hear the drone, I know someone is watching over us. That's not war. That's safety." Futuri was more than a military victory. It was a declaration. Burkina Faso, once overwhelmed and outmatched, could now plan, respond, and win. But with every success comes the next challenge. Can Futuri be repeated across the country? And more importantly, can this momentum last? The battle at Futuri didn't just shift military tactics. It changed the daily rhythm of life across the region in the days following the attack. What stood out most wasn't just the silence of gunfire. It was the sound of normal life returning. For the first time in years. Children played freely in schoolyards. Markets filled with voices and footsteps. Men returned to their farms. Women walked to town without fear. This is the civil impact of security, not measured in medals or speeches, but in reopened roads, delivered goods, and renewed routines. The local government in the eastern provinces was quick to act. With the route to Futuri secured, aid convoys resumed. Food supplies arrived in villages previously isolated by fear. Vaccination teams entered zones that had been unreachable for months. Mobile clinics returned. Radio stations, once silent due to security concerns, went back on air. But perhaps the most powerful sign of change came from the people themselves. In village after village, residents organized their own community patrols, not as vigilantes, but as partners with local forces. Elders began to meet regularly with commanders. Church and mosque leaders joined security briefings. It wasn't about militarization. It was about communication, about rebuilding trust between people and the state. One local chief put it this way: "For too long, our people felt abandoned. Now, we are being seen, and we are standing up with our army." This emotional shift matters in counterinsurgency. Local support is not optional. It is essential. Militants thrive in places where fear breaks trust, where civilians stay silent because they feel alone. But in Burkina Faso's east, that silence has started to break. There's also a visible political dimension. Following the Futuri victory, national polls showed a rise in public confidence in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership. Citizens expressed support not just for the army, but for the idea that progress is possible, that discipline and preparation are stronger than despair. The president addressed the nation 2 days after the battle. His message was simple: every victory belongs to the people. Every sacrifice honors our unity. It wasn't a long speech, but it resonated, especially for those who had lost family members in previous years of conflict. For many, it was the first time they believed that national leadership understood the local cost of insecurity. Meanwhile, within the government, new conversations began. The Ministry of Defense announced expanded drone training for rural units. The Ministry of Health coordinated with military logistics teams to better reach border communities. For the first time, security was being discussed as more than guns and uniforms. It was being framed as access, services, and dignity. And there's something else, something harder to measure, but impossible to ignore. People began to talk about staying before Futuri. Many families were quietly planning to leave, to cross borders, to start over somewhere safer. But in the wake of this victory, there was a shift in tone. Now, conversations began with, "Maybe we can wait a little longer. Maybe the village will hold. Maybe our sons don't have to leave." These are the seeds of stability. Of course, no one believes the danger is gone. Militants remain active across the Sahel. Retaliation is always possible, and for every attack prevented. There's another being planned elsewhere. But something is different now. People no longer feel helpless. They feel part of the response. One woman, a school principal, said it best. "We still lock the gates at night, but in the morning, we unlock them with hope." That is not just emotion. It's civic resilience. It's what happens when military gains translate into civilian confidence, when victories on the battlefield become fuel for everyday courage. Still, the question remains, what will it take to keep this momentum alive? Because every gain, every road reopened, every child returned to school can be lost if coordination fails or fatigue sets in. And that brings us to the bigger picture. How does this local change connect to regional security? And what does the world, especially the United States, see in all this? Thousands of miles away. Most Americans have never heard of a place called Futuri. But for those watching global security, what happened there carries weight beyond a battlefield. Burkina Faso, a small West African nation, is showing something that many Western strategists long debated: that nations in the Sahel can build their own modern defense systems if given tools, sovereignty, and decision-making power. The victory at Futuri didn't depend on foreign advisors or Western troops. It came from drones purchased from Turkey, armored vehicles from Europe, and a local force trained at home. It was a model of independent, integrated defense, and it worked. Some analysts in Washington are calling it a lesson in asymmetric warfare, where a smaller, better coordinated team, equipped with precise technology and actionable intelligence, can outmatch a larger but disorganized force from a U.S. perspective. It raises a strategic question. As global attention stretches thin across multiple conflicts, could smarter support, rather than direct intervention, deliver more lasting outcomes? And it's not just the U.S. asking this inside the European Union. And among peacekeeping circles at the United Nations, observers are watching Burkina Faso closely. They want to see if the Futuri victory is a short-lived exception or the first step in a wider shift, where African states regain control over their own security landscapes. One diplomat, speaking anonymously, put it simply: Futuri shows what happens when a country stops waiting for help and starts executing its own plan. The question now is, can they hold this line? Futuri was a victory, but not an end. Burkina Faso still faces daily threats. Armed groups are not gone. They're regrouping. They're adapting. They will test the system again. And next time, it might be in a different village, a different province, at a time no one expects. That's the nature of conflict in the Sahel, a region just below the Sahara, stretched thin by poverty, vast terrain, and weak borders. No one battle, no matter how decisive, can guarantee peace. But what Futuri gives us is proof that preparation works, that discipline matters, that when citizens and soldiers move in the same direction, even the most remote communities can resist collapse. The question now is, can Burkina Faso sustain this momentum? Can Captain Ibrahim Traoré keep building a force that's both modern and trusted? Can villages like Futuri continue to feel protected, not just for one day, but for months, even years? And for those of us watching from afar, especially in the United States, what role should we play? If this story moved you, think of the people of Futuri tonight. Think of a mother who didn't have to flee, a teacher who kept the school open, a farmer who returned to his fields not because the danger is over, but because hope, for once, outpaced fear. Security in Africa is not someone else's problem. What happens in the Sahel has ripple effects, from migration to regional trade to the fight against extremist networks. Stability there means safety here. So here's a thought. If this story reminded you of your family's history, of courage, of rebuilding, share it. If it stirred something in your faith, say a prayer tonight for peace in the Sahel. If it raised a question, write it down. Ask yourself, what does safety mean for ordinary people living under threat, and what would I hope for them? Burkina Faso is not yet at peace, but the Battle of Futuri showed that peace is possible. And maybe that's where hope begins. If you found this story valuable, please hit subscribe to stay informed on African affairs, like the video to support our work, and leave a comment. We want to hear your thoughts on America's role in the Sahel.